So the main difference between the first and the second molar is that, if you notice, it lacks a cusp of Carabelli, number one, and number two, the mesial cusp is larger than the distal cusp. Other than that, they're both rhomboidal in shape. The second molar tends to be a tiny bit smaller. So let's go and start waxing. As you notice, we're going pretty quickly all around to avoid leaving laminations on the inside of the coping. Get it a little bit thicker. If you get the wax really hot, it's gonna get very thin. So the way we do it to make a little thicker coping is we don't heat up the wax so much. Push it in, again making sure the margins are below the gums. I know I'm sounding a little bit redundant, but I just want you guys to remember all these little things that needs to be done with this model, or any other model for that fact. You always want to make sure the die is completely seated before you wax, because if it's not, you're not going to have any contacts on the occlusal surface when the doctor seats the crown. So right now I elected to start waxing the contacts first, just to change it up a little bit, and then I'll go ahead and do the cusp tips. Then we'll do the cusp ridges. As I said before, the mesial is going to be larger than the distal. Now we do the lingual cusp. we have to make sure that everything flows with the cusp tips according to the curve of Spee. So make sure everything lines up. Again, the lingual cusp is a slightly larger cusp than the buccal cusp. So now we're going to do the mesial lobe. Remember, this entire mesial portion is the mesial lobe. It's not like an anterior tooth which has 3 lobes on the labial. This has 2 lobes on the buccal, 1 for each cusp. Now, on the lingual, the mesial lobe is very large. I would say it's about at least 2/3 of the tooth, sometimes even 3/4. I've even seen a single lobe, and then the distal is like very tiny, tucked away in the distal part of the tooth. In this particular tooth, I would say that the mesial lobe is about 2/3 of the tooth. And then the distal lobe is about 1/3. We have our fish mouth there, which I'm going to enlarge a little bit. Now if you hit the die a little bit, it doesn't really matter because we're going to put wax over it anyhow. And this wax up it doesn't serve as a crown, so the interior of it is not that important right now. It's more important that we have enough room to wax our occlusion. So if you notice, this cusp tip is a tiny bit too far in, so I want to line it up with this one. So I'm going to bring it out a little. just like that. And then we fill up underneath that addition, just to make sure the cusp is nice and smooth. Okay, so the next thing we do is the mesiobuccal triangular ridge. We'll make it go straight up to the cusp tip, and we're going to make it wider at the bottom than on top. And then the distal buccal triangular ridge, same thing. Ooh, that was hot. Let's take that out and redo it. Let's make that a little less hot so we can build it up. Just like that. Wait for it to cool a little bit, and then we'll do the oblique ridge. You see how this one isn't really rhomboidal enough? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on making this more rhomboidal, which means that we need to make the mesiobuccal cusp come forward more. And also the distal buccal cusp come forward more. Just like that. I know that's a bit high, but we'll take it down later. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take away a little bit from the distal buccal here, to make the distal portion of the rhombus. And at the same time I noticed that this area here is a little bit too far out, so we're going to take that back so that we'll have less to take away later. And then I'm going to fill up these areas where I added, where there's a void right here. And a little bit right here. And then we're going to adjust the height of those cusps so that they line up with the rest of the teeth. a little bit more from the mesial, especially the mesial slope of the mesiobuccal cusp. And then we're gonna bring this out a little bit more where the triangular ridge is. So we're gonna make a little depression there and a little depression here, and that will increase the shape a little bit of the triangular ridge there. You see, right there. Because you want the ridge to end like right at the edge of the cusp. I'll take this in a little bit more. It's a little too far out. So it's lining up a little better now. Now we're gonna do the triangular ridge on the mesiolingual portion right here. So this is a triangular ridge, and we'll make it go towards the central pit. I'm gonna puddle it in a little bit here at the same time. Since we have a little space over here, we're gonna add a secondary ridge right here. And then we're gonna make the distolingual triangular ridge, which is gonna be very tiny. And it's gonna make up mostly the distal cusp. So the ridge itself is not gonna be separate from the cusp, but really the cusp is the distobuccal. I mean the distolingual triangular ridge there. So we're gonna puddle in the distal developmental groove a little bit, which will sharpen up later with the instrument. And we're gonna puddle in the distal area here. First I'm gonna try to make a secondary ridge if I can. If I can't, then we'll just puddle it in. Okay, and then this we're gonna just puddle in a little bit. Puddle in the mesial. We might make a little groove there later. And puddle in the distal marginal groove and the distobuccal triangular groove. So after this, what I'm gonna do is we're gonna pop the tooth out and adjust the margins, make it nice and neat. going to take it back all the way to the margin so it's nice and neat. Just don't press too hard because you're gonna break the wax. Just be gentle and have patience and drag the instrument back and forth. If you make a mistake like what I just did here and took away too much, we just add a little. Did it again. So we add again. Don't just forget about it, because if you don't add right away, you're gonna miss it and you're gonna hand in your work with that mistake on there. So always fix your mistakes as soon as you see them. So now we're gonna add a little bit to the buckle because I don't want that developmental groove to go down too far. Usually the most they go down to is about halfway, but that's very rare too. It's usually about 1/3. And once in a while, in a rare situation, you're gonna get a buckle pit right here. But that's rare. Just like that, you see? It's like a little pit, and then the rest is the buckle developmental groove, like that. So now, let's fix the mesial portion a little bit. Now wait for it to cool. Then we smooth it out. Now we put it back in the model and see the height of the marginal ridges. In this case, my marginal ridge is a tiny bit high, and it's also a tiny bit high here too. So we're going to lower it a bit. And after we lowered it, we're going to take it out. And we're going to round it off so that it looks more natural. add to this contact here. Wait for it to cool a little bit, and then we put it back in the model so we can pick up that contact, just like that. And now we have both contacts, so we can double check to see if the marginal ridges are the same, and they are. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make the marginal grooves, mesial and the distal, and they're also called what? The mesial and distal spillways. Then we're going to refine the distal lingual developmental groove. And we're going to refine the rest of the grooves a little bit. Remember, the developmental grooves break through the periphery of the tooth and join with the buccal developmental groove. Okay, so the distal lingual developmental groove joins with the lingual developmental groove right here. You see how it breaks through the periphery of the tooth? This is the periphery, and it goes right through. Same thing with the mesial and the distal marginal grooves. They all have that in common. They break through the periphery. Now you have the central groove right here. And we know that those are developmental grooves also because they go through the transverse ridge and they divide it. So the distal marginal groove, the central groove here, and the buccal developmental groove here divide off the distal buccal cusp here, or the distal buccal lobe. Same thing here, the mesial marginal groove, the central groove, and the buccal groove blocks off or boundaries of the buccal mesiobuccal lobe. Now the distal lingual groove is the boundary of the mesiolingual cusp right here, and the distal lingual cusp right here, which is the mesiolingual lobe and the distal lingual lobe. So when we do refine the grooves, remember the sharp parts of the groove are on the inside of the tooth, and as the grooves come to the outside, they kind of shallow out, they feather out, sort of like a fan. So it goes from sharp to a depression. Okay. Goes from a sharp area to a depression. Okay, so here we're going to refine the peripheral ridge. The peripheral ridge is the ridge that goes around here, all around the occlusal surface. Now the peripheral ridge includes all the cusp ridges combined on the outside of the occlusal surface. So that's our second molar.